Greetings and welcome to the podcast. This is Historia Cambriae Antiquae, and I'm your host, Luke. This is the podcast where we talk about medieval Welsh history and the uniqueness that is Wales in the early Middle Ages. From grand legends to complex dynastic histories, this podcast tries to unravel a history that is far too often overshadowed by Wales' dramatic neighbor. As opposed to the more common Anglo-centric podcast, this podcast aims to be Cambro-centric. With that, let's get cracking on the episode. The large hill fort of Dinas Powys in Wales has a long and storied past, and what lies beneath it tells a tale of a time oft forgotten. Created long before even the Romans arrived, this Neolithic earthwork remained important through the imperial occupation and after. Through this episode of the podcast, we will be discussing what is known as the sub-Roman period in the history of the Isle of Britain, immediately after the Romans withdrew their formal military force in the 5th century. To better understand this period, we must understand the Romans' impact on Britain. They brought grand buildings, greater bureaucracy, and centralized leadership to the disparate people groups in Britain. As an aside, to use the word tribe here would be a disservice to this history, as the term tribe is somewhat ambiguous and reflects a time where all peoples who were deemed uncivilized by the Western world were classified as tribal. Generally, however, the native peoples on the Isle of Britain can be called Britons, Britons. Due to the unsure nature of classification of these peoples as Celts, we will continue to call them Britons. After the Roman conquest and pacification of southern Britain, the Romans brought builders to craft the great works that could be seen anywhere on the Italian peninsula at the time. Great bathhouses, villas with heated floors, and expansive military fortifications followed not long after the Roman conquest. Many Roman ruins can be seen today on the Isle of Britain, especially the grand Roman bathhouses at the appropriately named Bath in Somerset. This changed the landscape of Britain drastically. Britons, being people that before the Romans never formed vast kingdoms or empires, were now part of a large empire that thrived off its urban life. Until the time of the conquest, the most that Britain centralized was around large hill forts. The exact usage of these hill forts is uncertain, as finds have differed among them. It seems, though, that most hill forts had some sort of storing purpose for crops. Other than that, scholars debate their purpose and the makeup of their inhabitants. Once the Romans gained control, many hill forts were abandoned, in favor of the towns and villas that the new administration of Britain had brought with them. Within Wales itself, towns emerged surrounding the great military forts. One of the largest Roman forts in Wales was at Caerleon in modern-day Monmouthshire in the south, and a bustling Roman metropolis sprung up around it. The amphitheater at Caerleon that provided entertainment for those in the area remains marvelously preserved from the Roman period. The Britons eventually took to Roman culture, and throughout the 3.5 centuries that the Romans ruled, a distinct Romano-British culture emerged. Not giving up their native traditions while adopting the manners of the Roman caused this blend of cultures. A notable, if completely legendary, Romano-British figure is Arthur, who we may talk about in a later podcast. The Romans' withdrawal from Britain was by no means sudden and would not have come as a total shock to those Britons under the Romans' rule. Massive economic issues came with such a large empire, especially while controlling territories that span natural borders like the English Channel. Additionally, what is known as the Great Conspiracy in 367 AD greatly hampered Roman rule in Britain. The Roman soldiers at Hadrian's Wall, on Roman Britain's northern border, just south of the border between England and Scotland today, rebelled, allowing the Picts of the north to enter Roman Britain and pillage the area. Gaelic raiders sacked and invaded the west coast of Britain, and Germans sacked and invaded southeast Britain. To add on to the chaos, many deserting soldiers and escaped slaves wandered around the countryside, robbing to support themselves. This caused a great panic among the Roman elite, seeing all these events as a concerted effort against the rule in Britain, hence the name conspiracy. There were other major events that marked the endings of Roman rule in Britain. A man named Magnus Maximus, who was a junior officer in the Roman military during the Great Conspiracy, gained significant power in Britain and held great respect from his troops. Gratian, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire at the time, was largely unpopular. So, Magnus thought he should have a go at the throne. In 383, Magnus Maximus was declared emperor by his troops in Britain. He then moved his army across the English Channel to Gaul to solidify himself as emperor over the West. Magnus defeated Gratian in battle near Paris, and Gratian fled to Lyon in the south of France where he was killed. At this point, Magnus was not able to push any further into the Italian peninsula as he did not have the troops. Thus, he became the emperor of Britain, Gaul, Iberia, and Africa, which at this point just meant North Africa as far east as Tunisia. He minted his own coins and adjudicated cases in his realm in order to solidify in his subjects' minds the reality of his rule over them. It seems that at some point later, Magnus became a little overzealous, as he later pushed the emperor in Italy, at that time Valentinian II, who subsequently fled to Theodosius I in the Eastern Roman Empire. These two emperors invaded and smashed Magnus's usurpation and executed him. The memory of Magnus, despite his failure, lived on in the British mindset. Although Magnus was Iberian by birth, he began his rebellion in Britain and used many British troops in his conquest. Magnus thus became a British hero for centuries to come. His Welsh name is Maxen Wledig. In later Welsh tellings, the story goes that Maxen was a wealthy Roman emperor who, upon having a dream about a beautiful woman in a grandiose castle, sends envoys to all corners of the world to find her. One envoy returns and says that they found her on the island of Britain. Maxen then conquers the island of Britain from the native British rulers and finds the woman at a place called Abersaint, which in Welsh means mouth of the Saint River. Today, this is near modern Aberdaron in the north of Wales on the Llŷn Peninsula. Maxen greets the woman as Empress of Rome, which seems a little bold. Her real name is revealed as Ellen Loeddog, and they wed. Maxen stays in Britain so long that a new emperor is declared in Rome, who threatens Maxen to never return to Rome lest he be killed. Maxen takes his army, defiantly, and a band of British soldiers to the continent, conquering Iberia and Gaul. When he comes to the city of Rome, Maxen conquers it only by the might of the British soldiers who besieged the city and killed the new emperor. Maxen then regains control of the Roman Empire and full status as emperor. The British soldiers split up into two groups, with one group going back to Britain and the other settling in Brittany in France. Now, this tale gives a lot of great content to those attempting to weed out cultural memories of historical developments. First, the conquering of Britain by Maxen Wledig seems to be an overall explanation of how the Romans came to Britain, overthrowing the rulership. Despite this, Maxen marries a British noblewoman, evoking the idea of a blending of these two cultures. The idea of a unique Romano-British identity is evoked here as a literal marriage between two characters. The rest of the story plays out as later historical events. The conquering of Gaul and Iberia by Maxen Wledig seems to align quite well with true historical events. Despite this, his success at Rome breaks from the historical accuracy. The usefulness of the British soldiers could be a memory of the British auxiliary troops that were part of the Roman military. Finally, the settling of Britons in Brittany, also known as Little Britain, or in Welsh Llydaw, could be seen as an explanation for the Brythonic speakers of Brittany, although it seems that the historical settlement came later during the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain, where many native Britons were displaced. The tales that the Romano-Britons told many years after Roman rule solidified in their minds their connection with the Roman Empire. The Romans impacted the physical landscape in their buildings of roads and fortresses, which were symbols of the Romans' power and martial capability. These buildings would become important in later history too. The Romans left the people of Britain to their own devices in 410 AD, when all Roman troops were withdrawn from Britain in order to fight other wars around the empire. This left a massive power vacuum in Britain. This vacuum was quickly filled, however, with various leaders claiming small pockets of land. Most of these were in previous areas designated by the Romans, and many grew around previous Roman forts. At this time, the title of dux, spelled D-U-X, appears often. Many of the leaders of their tiny realms would style themselves dux, meaning leader in Latin. This title was used to identify a general during Roman rule, and leaders would take this title in order to gain legitimacy for their authority. This legitimacy in Britain was important, as the people had been under Roman rule for so many centuries that they were unsure how the power dynamic would change now that they were disconnected from the powerful empire, and gaining allegiance was important for those leaders looking to gain power in the sub-Roman period. Many of the leaders from this time were part of the traditional Roman elite, as there were some descriptions of leaders as "he who wears red," an epithet tying the leader to earlier Roman nobility. These leaders often found themselves with bases of operations in and around Roman fortresses and structures. They also even continued to build Roman structures, as a villa in Gloucestershire has revealed a Roman-style mosaic dating to after the Romans had withdrawn from Britain, showing the continuation of Roman style in the Isle. Other leaders, however, did not take to the idea of Roman legitimacy. This brings us back to the hill fortress at Dinas Powys in South Wales. An archaeological dig in the 1950s revealed pottery at the hill fort dating from the 5th and 7th centuries AD. This meant that the hill fort had been utilized after the Romans had left, and that the owner of this hill fort was remarkably well connected, as the pottery comes mainly from the Mediterranean. It is likely that some leaders vying for power took control of the hill fort immediately after Roman withdrawal. Instead of identifying themselves with the imperial power of Rome, these leaders chose to align themselves with the native British idea of power centered around mighty hill forts. In specifically identifying with these hill forts, they attempted to create a new native rule for Britain, free of the Roman yoke, politically and culturally. As we can see with the tale of Max and Wledig, however, the idea of the Britons as a Roman people won out in the long run. Most of those leaders who returned to hill forts came from areas where, centuries before, it was common for the natives to rebel against Roman rule. The hill fort at Dinas Powys presents a prime example of this. Dinas Powys, lying in the Vale of Glamorgan, was near the center of the lands of the Silur group of native Britons. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, talks about the Silurs as a people which neither terror nor mercy had the least effect. The rebellious nature of the Silurs throughout the 1st century AD could well have carried on through the people inhabiting this area under Roman rule. It is also plausible that these leaders who occupied hill forts came from the ancient authority of Silurs, perhaps leaders in the Silurian community. It would be more likely for the leaders of this ancient stock to identify themselves more with the claim their ancestors had at the hill forts, as opposed to the new Roman rule to which they perhaps had no connection. This period of realm building in sub-Roman Britain was heavily mythologized in later Welsh tales and texts. One such tale is that of Vortigern, the High King of Britain in the 5th century. There is no direct evidence to claim that Vortigern ever existed aside from the tales that were told about him. His figure, however, became incredibly important in Welsh medieval genealogies, specifically in the Kingdom of Powys, which has no connection to the hill fort of Dinas Powys, which dominated mid-Wales for most of the early Middle Ages. The main Welsh story we have about Vortigern is from Historia Britonum, Latin for History of the Britons, which is believed to have been written around 828 AD. In this story, Vortigern is reigning as High King of Britain when the Picts launch an onslaught of attacks against the native Britons. Vortigern cannot defeat these Picts, so he looks towards mercenaries to aid him in his fight. Namely, Vortigern recruits 2 Saxon mercenary leaders, brothers Hengist and Horsa. Hengist and Horsa defeat the Picts at every turn, but they see how lacking the martial abilities of the Britons are and how ineffectual Vortigern is as a ruler, and they decide to take advantage of this. One night, while feasting with Vortigern, Hengist and Horsa get Vortigern's retinue fully inebriated, whereupon they kill Vortigern's men and take him hostage. From this, Vortigern is forced to cede a large part of what is now the east of England today, namely Essex, Sussex, and Middlesex, the last of which is under Greater London today, to his assailants, adding on to the area of Kent that the Saxons had already gained by earlier trickery in the tale. As such, the Anglo-Saxons gain their foothold on the island of Britain and begin conquering west from there. In this tale, Vortigern is the worst possible king, one who loses land to even those who were supposed to be his allies. In this tale, Vortigern is the main reason for the Anglo-Saxon conquering and subduing of the native Britons in the east. Elsewhere in the tale, Vortigern marries his own daughter and is later slain by God through the prayers of Saint Germanus of Auxerre for his evil ways. Despite this depiction, however, the royal line of the Kingdom of Powys at the time this was written, known as the Cadeching dynasty from one of its great rulers, Cadech Thrunshug, claimed descent from Vortigern. Why would a royal line claim descent from one of the worst tyrants in Welsh memory? Context, the Historia Britonum, will provide us the answer to this question. This text was completed in 828, but more specifically, it was written within the Kingdom of Gwynedd in 828. The 2 kingdoms of Powys and Gwynedd, because they shared a very large border, were ever at odds with one another. In Gwynedd, a powerful new conqueror from a line separate of the old kings of Gwynedd, named Mervyn Vrych, ruled, and he had greater ambitions than just Gwynedd. The Historia Britonum could be described as a sort of slander against the line of Powys, and as such the legitimacy of its current king, who at the time of its completion was Cungan ap Cadell. The Powesian rule gained legitimacy through their connection to the High King of all Britain in Vortigern, known in Welsh as Gwerthern. In fact, one of the regions of the Kingdom of Powys was named Gwertherinion in his honor. In the mid-9th century, perhaps even as a rebuttal to the Historia Britonum, although this cannot be confirmed, a pillar was erected in the Kingdom of Powys by King Cungan, with an inscription bearing the deeds of his grandfather Eliseth against the Angles of Mercia. On it, the name Vortigern is inscribed as one of Cungan's ancestors. Connecting this story further, Vortigern is cited as being married to Severa, a daughter of Magnus Maximus, or as the Welsh called him, Maxen Wledig. Despite there being a lack of Roman sources attesting to any marriage between Magnus's daughter and a British king, or even the fact that Magnus had a daughter named Severa, this story survives in the carving. What story was the Powesian royal line promoting about Vortigern? This is a more difficult question. The British monk Gildas, in his De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written sometime around the early 6th century, condemns numerous British kings of his day. In his polemic, Gildas condemns Vortigern as the reason the Saxons conquered most of Britain and for their domination. This certifies a very early source of the tale of Vortigern granting territory to the Saxons. It is very unlikely for the Powesian account of Vortigern to be completely different from Gildas's account, especially in the area of his great failings. Perhaps, though, the kings of Powys remembered him solely through his birthright as a high king of Britain and as a successor to Roman authority through his marriage to Severa. Likely, too, is that Vortigern had successes in becoming High King of Britain before his troubles with the Picts, which the Powesian storytellers could have focused on. Although Gildas's account gives us the most contemporary information on Vortigern, he is not described as a High King of Britain in Gildas's account. This appears later in the English monk Bede's work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the 8th century. In fact, Gildas does not classify Vortigern as a bad king, but says that he was unlucky, as his mercenaries proved disloyal to him. This is very likely the story that the Powesian royal line wanted people around Britain to believe, that Vortigern's power waned due to his trusting nature and the treachery of the Saxon mercenaries. The sub-Roman period was immensely important to later Welsh history. It was a time of realm and genealogy building, and its effects lasted far into the Middle Ages in Wales. The divisions between power centers and tales in sub-Roman Britain led to differences in the later kingdoms. In some later podcasts, I intend to focus on the various kingdoms that grew out of this sub-Roman period, as they all have an interesting and unique history and identity. For now, though, this has been a podcast on sub-Roman Britain, and here it ends.